As everyone is abiding by the stay-at-home advisory, there is a great deal of concern for victims of domestic violence. Advocates say many may be living with the abuser, making it dangerous to reach out for help. Janis Broderick, the executive director of the Elizabeth Freeman Center in Great Barrington, spoke with Carolee McGrath to explain how her agency continues to provide services in the midst of this crisis.
Let me just say right away that we are open and operating 24/7 with our services. So this is a really dangerous time right now. The necessary response we're taking to curtail and stop the spread of coronavirus is creating the very conditions that have always resulted in increased danger of domestic and sexual violence. The closing of schools and daycares, the closing of workplaces, closing courts, overwhelmed police departments, the financial stress, the isolation in the home. Shelter in place where people are staying in the home is supposed to make us safer. But for so many in our community, home is not safe. So we have kind of adapted to this crisis. We're doing as much work as we can remotely because we're not allowed in the courts or police departments as we usually are. But we are keeping our offices open with minimal staffing so that we can handle emergencies. Through our 24-hour hotline, we can provide all sorts of emergency services, including shelter, transportation, food assistance, safe phones, so that people can access resources. So we're trying to be an open door in this community for folks who need our help.
Talk a little bit about the emergency shelter and some of the food services that you talked about, and even transportation. That obviously is a big challenge with all of the social distancing and trying to make sure that everybody is safe.
Well, for shelter, we have a residential shelter, which is currently full. We're adapting to social distancing. We have conversations going on all the time. We have now begun preparing 3 meals a day to cut back on crowding in our common areas, as well as to cut back on outside interactions. We are also using motels to keep people safe, and those, like I said, are available at all times. Transportation is an absolute necessity in Berkshire County. So we are using different resources to try to help people get to safety. The other thing I also want to kind of emphasize is that we work with people in any kind of situation. So we do a lot of safety planning with folks who are experiencing trouble, and we can do that for people who are getting out of a violent situation, and we can do that for people who are choosing to stay in their homes throughout this crisis. People are afraid. People are afraid to come out. People don't want to catch the virus. It's a big unknown out there. So we have been doing more and more counseling with folks to develop plans about what to do if something happens.
The Boston Globe reported that there's a decline for domestic violence calls in an article last week. Are you experiencing that in Berkshire County, and what would you attribute that to?
Yeah, I think across the state there's been a decline in calls, and we've seen that here. When I looked at our last month's statistics, there was a 20% decrease in calls. There's been more than a 50% decrease in protection order filings. It's very concerning. I think there's 2 major reasons why we're seeing that right now. One is people are afraid. The coronavirus is a pandemic. People don't want to catch it. People are taking the social distancing and the shelter-in-place requirements very seriously. So people are holding on. I think the other thing that goes on is because of the social distancing and the isolation, folks who might call for help or try to get help, it's much more difficult. If you're living in a household with your abuser, a lot of times we hear from people when, the abuser might be at work or, not in the home. That's not happening so much anymore. I think there's also another big reason, I should have said 3, and that's because there's a lot of closed doors right now. I mean, whereas we saw a lot of people coming into courthouses, for example, to get help and protection, the courts, because of the virus, are basically closed. They will still hear restraining orders and protection orders, but you have to do it by phone, and increasingly you have to do it outside on the steps of the courthouse or in some other place by phone. So access to help is uncertain, I think, for a lot of people. I also think that it's less accessible.
The American Psychological Association, among others, has been discussing, just the higher risk that you were talking about in these types of natural disasters. In particular, they talked about a study about Hurricane Harvey that was done by psychologist Josie Serrata, who really looked at how these crises really increase the risk for women and men who are abused.
Yeah, and I think recently we've seen the UN Secretary General come out and urge all governments around the world to address the increase in domestic and sexual violence within their plans for dealing with the coronavirus, and reported that throughout the world, again, there have been 200 to 300% increases in calls relating to domestic violence. We believe we'll see that here, even though we're going through a period where the number of calls have decreased. The dam will break. We will see that increase here in the United States and in Massachusetts as well. We know we have a crisis. Berkshire County has historically had high rates of violence, and that's not atypical of rural communities. I mean, we've had 9 deaths, murders related to domestic violence in just over 3 years. Our rate of protection orders is 33% higher than the state average by population. We know that violence hasn't stopped.
You had mentioned also a big concern is that schools are closed, daycares are closed, and children are also at risk. We've had a doctor on our show previously who talked about the increased risk again for children as well, because if you're not going to school, somebody who might see that something is a little off is now not seeing that child. How do you help families who are also experiencing this?
Well, we've been working very closely with the Berkshire District Attorney's Office to get information out about emergency services that are available, hotlines, and places where people can go for help. But it is a concern. I mean, in large part in terms of dealing with domestic and sexual violence for adults and for children, part of it is the community taking care of each other. And all of those kind of resources and eyes are basically gone now.
How do you advise people as we proceed through this? I mean, it could be weeks, it could be months. What's your best advice for somebody who really needs help?
I would say call us, please. You're not alone. We can help. You can call us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you are someone who has concerns about someone else, you can call us. If you hear something going on nearby you, in your neighborhood, in the house next door, in the apartment below, call the police.